A black man was removed from his first-class seat because he didn't look like he belonged. 12 minutes later, the plane was ordered to turn around. 2 weeks later, he turned that very seat into a global symbol of quiet justice. What do you think he did? This isn't just a story about discrimination. It's a story about silent power, about a CEO who didn't have to raise his voice to make the whole world listen, and about a seat that was once denied, now honored by an entire nation. Atlanta, 7:46 a.m. Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport was buzzing like a giant human beehive. Rolling suitcases clicked across the white-tiled floor. The repeating sounds of flight announcements over the PA system played like the background music of a world always in motion. A world where time was money and every second counted. Amid the flow of people rushing toward their departure gates, a black man in a simple light gray coat, unpolished leather shoes, and carrying nothing but a worn black carry-on walked calmly toward the first-class section. No one recognized him, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Chancellor Holt was not the kind of man who drew attention in a crowd, not because he lacked anything worth noticing, but because he knew how to disappear. At 45, he was the founder and CEO of Dominion Air, one of the fastest-growing private airline companies in America, catering to investors, politicians, and moneyed elites who preferred to fly quietly above the noise. But today, he wasn't flying to be served. He was flying to observe, incognito, with no assistant, no reputation, no power trailing behind. The flight was D202 from Atlanta to New York, scheduled to depart at 8:30 a.m. He held a first-class ticket, seat 1A, booked through an internal system using a fake identity with special access privileges. Everything was legitimate, everything was by the book, and yet something still felt off. As Chancellor approached the first-class check-in desk, the receptionist, a white woman in her early 30s with a name tag that read Marla, glanced up and something shifted in her eyes. A hesitation without words, a scan from his shoes to his hairline, a judgment rendered in seconds without evidence. "Sir, are you sure this is the right gate?" Marla asked, her voice maintaining a sugary professionalism, but the thin sheet of ice beneath it was easy to detect. Chancellor gently raised his phone and presented the digital ticket. Marla scanned the QR code, her eyes narrowing slightly when she saw First Class, Seat 1A. The pause was brief, but enough for Chancellor to notice. She examined the ticket longer than necessary, combing through the lines as if hunting for some hidden error. After a few awkward seconds, she handed the phone back with a mechanical smile. "Welcome aboard, sir." But the way she said "sir," like she was reading from a script, not speaking from respect, didn't slip past him. He walked through the gate, his pace steady, his mind sharp. This was the part he knew best, the quiet before the storm. Chancellor didn't need anyone to know who he was. He wanted to know who they truly were, when they thought he was nobody. The first-class cabin opened up like a miniature oasis of luxury. Wide leather seats, warm amber lighting, and a faint hint of bergamot orange in the air. Chancellor made his way to seat 1A, the far left corner by the window, a position he'd chosen deliberately for maximum visibility. But before he could set his bag down, a voice cut through the elegant calm behind him. "Excuse me, sir. I think you might be in the wrong seat." He turned around. A man in a co-pilot uniform, about 40 years old, tall, with a close-cropped haircut and a stern face that barely concealed his disdain, was looking at him with tight discomfort. Behind him stood the lead flight attendant, also a white woman, arms crossed, gaze locked onto Chancellor with visible suspicion. Chancellor paused for a second, then calmly replied, "I believe this is seat 1A. He handed over the ticket. The co-pilot glanced at it, gave a quick nod like he was ticking off a box, then murmured to the attendant, "Can you double-check this?" The flight attendant pulled out her iPad, typed in the seat number. A cold nod followed. "It checks out." But then she stepped closer to him, her tone dropping a register. "I'm sorry, sir, but we've had system glitches before. Are you absolutely sure this isn't a booking error?" Chancellor said nothing, meeting her eyes directly. The silence stretched long enough to thicken the air. A few passengers looked up from their magazines and iPads. No one said anything. No one intervened. But everyone saw. A strange moment unfolded where the one who was right had to prove he wasn't wrong, simply because he didn't look the part they were expecting. Eventually, after a hushed exchange, the flight attendant spoke again, her voice velvet wrapped in steel. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to move to the back of the plane while we sort this out." Chancellor looked at her, then around the cabin. Empty seats, eyes watching, silence expanding. He took a breath, nodded, and said nothing. He picked up his bag, turned around, and walked past a sea of glances, some puzzled, others relieved. No one stopped him. No one asked why, because everyone understood in their own quiet way that here sometimes a look still outweighed a ticket. Seat 1A remained empty, but it was no longer meant for someone with skin like his. The airplane aisle was narrow and long, like a metallic tunnel guiding Chancellor to the very back of the aircraft, a place he hadn't sat in since founding Dominion Air. The last row near the restroom was notoriously known for noise and odor complaints. His carry-on was lifted into the overhead compartment by a different flight attendant this time, a young woman with dark brown hair, whose apologetic glance brushed over him as if silently saying, "I'm sorry for them," yet unable to speak it aloud. Chancellor took his seat, folding his hands on his lap, eyes fixed ahead. The seat was harder. No personal touchscreen, no welcome drink. Everything was a far cry from Seat 1A, the one he had personally designed to be the standard for Dominion's highest-paying clients. He wasn't angry, at least not yet. He needed to observe. He needed everything to unfold completely. The flight began to board its final passengers. One by one, they entered the cabin, most wearing suits, carrying laptops, or still on mid-Zoom calls. An older man with a full head of white hair and an air of quiet wealth stepped in and made his way toward the front rows. Chancellor glanced at him. Their eyes happened to meet. The man, who Chancellor would later learn was named Walter, slightly furrowed his brows upon seeing Chancellor seated all the way in the back. It wasn't disdain, but surprise. He looked as if he was about to say something, but then chose not to. Walter continued toward Seat 2B, a world away from where Chancellor sat. For a moment, Chancellor recalled the internal reports he'd reviewed. Complaints about flight attendant behavior, about unequal service, about passengers being bumped to lower seats when they didn't look the part, especially when technical glitches provided an excuse. But no one had ever stared that truth in the face. Not until now. The lead flight attendant returned. She leaned down, speaking more softly this time, her tone lower and more deliberate. "Sir, we're still verifying your ticket. Please remain seated." Chancellor nodded slightly, saying nothing. She turned and walked away, leaving behind a chill in the air. Tasha, a black flight attendant, the only one who had given him a genuine smile when he was reassigned, stepped over gently, handing him a hot towel. "I hope this helps a little, sir," she said quietly, then quickly turned away. Chancellor offered a faint smile and nodded. No one else in the cabin received a towel. No one else was called sir, with that kind of dignity in their voice. As the plane began taxiing toward the runway, Chancellor caught his own reflection in the small round window. Not the image of a successful CEO, but that of an anonymous passenger, pushed to the back of the plane for not fitting the mold. A part of him ached. Another part took quiet note. The co-pilot, the same man who'd kicked him out of Seat 1A, walked past on his way to the cockpit. But as he passed Chancellor, he paused for just a split second, then muttered under his breath, "People like you shouldn't push your luck," and kept walking. Chancellor didn't respond, but his eyes suddenly deepened, like a still lake struck by stone. In just a few minutes, the plane would take off, and in just a few minutes, the watch on Chancellor's wrist would receive a special signal. A signal only the founder of Dominion Air had the authority to send, one capable of changing the entire course of the flight. Everything was now in place. The plane gave a soft roar as the wheels rolled down the tarmac, gaining speed steadily. Chancellor leaned back in his seat, eyes half closed as if dozing off. But in reality, he was memorizing every detail. The way the lead flight attendant cast glances at him each time she walked past. The way the passengers around him, mostly young professionals in suits with AirPods, avoided eye contact, as if scared to get entangled with something that didn't match their vibe. Tasha passed again, this time handing him a bottle of water. No one else received water. No one said a word. Chancellor quietly unlocked his phone, angling it toward the window to avoid the gaze of any nearby attendants. Within the Dominion admin app, a hidden interface appeared with a silver lock icon. He entered the unique access code granted only to the founder, a command to suspend the flight in case of internal emergency. No alarm, no flashing lights, just a subtle message across the screen. Code 19 executed. Return to gate initiated. The plane was only a few hundred meters from liftoff, but in the cockpit, an internal alert sounded. The captain turned to the co-pilot, face tensed. "We just got a code 19, he said. "Dominion override. We're grounded." Neither of them knew that the man they had just insulted was the very reason everything was about to flip. In the cabin, the PA system crackled to life. "Due to a technical flag from our system, we've been instructed to return to gate for inspection. We apologize for the delay." A few passengers sighed. A man in front shot an annoyed look at Chancellor, as if blaming him for the inconvenience. Chancellor didn't react. He just stared out the window, his expression unchanged, quietly slipping the phone back into his jacket pocket. Walter, the older gentleman seated up front, turned his head to look back at Chancellor. Something in his gaze shifted. No longer surprise, no longer silence, but the dawning sense that he'd just witnessed something unusual. As the plane returned to the gate, the door opened and a team of ground security personnel boarded, accompanied by a senior Dominion operations director. The atmosphere in the cabin snapped taut. Some passengers began whispering. Tasha took a step back when she saw the sharply dressed man in a light gray suit walking straight toward Chancellor. The man stopped, bowed his head slightly and said, "Mr. Holt, we are ready when you are." No one knew what was happening, but Chancellor stood, straightened his jacket, and stepped into the aisle. Every eye turned toward him. He didn't need to say a word. That silence alone made a few people break into nervous sweats. The lead flight attendant turned pale. The co-pilot emerged from the cockpit, about to ask what was going on, only to freeze when he saw Chancellor standing dead center in the first-class cabin. "I'm Chancellor Holt," he said, without raising his voice. "I'm the founder and CEO of Dominion Air. And what just happened to me, what you all saw, is exactly why this airline needs to change." The air exploded in silence. A young passenger near the window blurted out, "Oh my God!" Someone dropped a coffee cup. Walter was stunned. The co-pilot lost his footing. The lead flight attendant's hands began to tremble. And in the back of the cabin, Tasha broke into tears. The air in the cabin felt vacuumed out. Everyone sat still, frozen in what seemed like a collective psychological crash. Chancellor Holt, the man who had been removed from seat 1A simply because his skin and attire didn't fit the part, was now standing at the center of the first-class cabin. No longer the disregarded passenger, but the CEO of the entire airline. Every eye was locked on him, no longer skeptical, only stunned. Some people looked like they wanted to speak but didn't, because nothing said at this moment could be timed right. The lead flight attendant, the one who had insisted on removing him, stood frozen, her face drained of color. She stammered, I didn't know, sir." Chancellor turned toward her, not with fury, not with shouting, but with a cold, clear gaze that pierced deeper than any reprimand. "You didn't have to know who I was to treat me like a human being." His voice wasn't loud, but it echoed through the cabin like a verdict. The man in seat 2C lowered his head, avoiding Chancellor's eyes. Walter sat motionless, hands clenched together. "Let's not pretend this is about me," Chancellor said, now turning back to the aisle. "This is about every single passenger who's ever been judged before they even took their seat. This is about every voice that didn't get heard because it didn't sound expensive enough." Each word he spoke was like a needle popping the polished veneer of this luxury aircraft cabin. A senior Dominion operations manager entered and whispered something into Chancellor's ear. He nodded, then looked at the co-pilot, still frozen by the cockpit door. "Sir, I believe you owe me an apology," he said. The co-pilot's lips parted. "I didn't mean to." Chancellor raised his hand to interrupt. "What you meant is irrelevant. What you did is what matters." He shifted his gaze to the lead flight attendant. "Same goes for you." She trembled, nodding repeatedly, muttering almost robotically, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. No one said a word, but everyone knew. Apologies couldn't undo action. And then Chancellor turned his head to the back of the cabin, to where he'd been sent. The seat by the toilet was still there, still carrying the warmth of someone who had been pushed down by an invisible system. He walked slowly toward it. A few passengers thought he was retrieving luggage, but he wasn't. Chancellor stopped at the seat, staring at the cramped space around it, then said clearly, "This is where I was told to sit. This is what you thought I was worth." Everyone held their breath. He turned to the left, placing his hand gently on the seat's armrest, as if inaugurating an invisible courtroom. This isn't just about comfort. It's about dignity. This row, right here, is where judgment happens. Not up there in first class, not in the lounge with champagne, but right here, next to the toilets, where people get sent when they don't fit your idea of who belongs up front. No one spoke. A heavy silence pressed down across the entire cabin. In that moment, Chancellor wasn't just speaking for this airplane. He was speaking for millions who'd ever been wrongly judged, ever pushed to the back row of life because they didn't look the part. He didn't return to seat 1A. Instead, he stood there in the aisle, next to the restroom. Every sentence that followed landed like a quiet indictment. No yelling, but every word carried the weight of a hammer. When you decide someone doesn't belong in a seat because of how they look, you're not just moving them physically, you're moving them morally, culturally, psychologically. You're telling them they don't deserve the view, the legroom, the dignity. A young woman in row 3 who had giggled earlier when he was removed, now buried her face in her hands. The clack of a keyboard echoed as one passenger began typing notes. Someone else discreetly recorded the moment on their phone. Tasha, the only crew member who had shown kindness, stood at the back, eyes red, hands clasped like she was awaiting a verdict. Chancellor saw her. He gave a small nod, a gesture that said not only thank you, but I see you. She had done the right thing when no one else did. Chancellor turned toward the captain, who had remained silent until now. "Captain," he called, "did you see what happened back there?" The captain nodded hesitantly. "I did, sir." Chancellor didn't need to say more. He simply added, "And you said nothing." The captain bowed his head. Moments later, the Dominion manager spoke up. "Sir, we're ready to proceed with the formal review, if you'd like us to begin on board." Chancellor nodded. "Let's do it here, in front of everyone. That's where the damage happened. That's where the reckoning begins." And so, right there on the aircraft, in full view of every passenger, an internal investigation began. Chancellor ordered the cabin security cameras to be reviewed, and the footage of him being removed from seat 1A was played. A temporary screen was set up via tablet, linked to the Dominion server. The clip lasted less than 2 minutes, but every second was a gut punch. One passenger whispered, "This is disgusting." The co-pilot had no defense. The lead flight attendant said nothing. Walter, the older gentleman who had stayed silent from the beginning, now stood and spoke. His voice was rough but grounded in accountability. "I watched it all happen. I didn't speak up. I thought it wasn't my place. I was wrong. We were all wrong." Chancellor turned to him, not with anger, but with a nod. "It's not about being perfect. It's about knowing when silence becomes complicity." The plane hadn't even left the gate, but the cabin had become a courtroom, one where justice didn't wear robes, but needed only courage. After a short hearing, the co-pilot was officially terminated. The lead flight attendant was suspended. The captain was reassigned and removed from takeoff duty. Chancellor signaled to the Dominion representative to document the decisions. No one protested. No one dared. As the cabin calmed, Chancellor looked around, not with the cold sharpness from earlier, but with a gentler gaze, like the sky clearing after a storm. "I won't be taking this flight," he said, "but I hope all of you take something else from this." He walked to the back where Tasha still stood. "You did the right thing," he told her, "and I want you to help me make sure this never happens again." Tasha choked back a sob. "How?" Chancellor gave a soft smile. "We'll start something new, and you'll help lead it." Then he stepped off the plane. A round of applause erupted from the cabin, not because he was the CEO, but because he had stood up when he had every reason to stay silent. The airplane door closed behind Chancellor Holt, and in that instant, the world outside seemed to fall completely silent. No more overhead announcements. No more restless footsteps in the cabin. No more probing stares or delayed justifications. It was just him now, in the long hallway leading toward Dominion's operations center at the airport. But inside his mind, another door had just swung open. A door to a memory he had kept locked away for over 30 years. Chancellor didn't look back at the airplane resting quietly on the tarmac. He knew that what needed to happen had happened. What needed to be seen had been seen. But the deepest echo within him wasn't the embarrassment of the co-pilot, the remorse in Walter's eyes, or even the gratitude from Tasha. It was an old, familiar feeling, one as ancient as his own story. The feeling of a little boy being sent to the back of the bus because his mother didn't have the right skin color. He was 10 years old then, the Bronx, New York, scorching summer heat. He sat beside his mother on an aging public bus, holding tightly to the lunchbox she had packed to bring to the clinic where she worked night shifts as a nurse. His mother, Elaine Holt, was a strong woman, with eyes that always shone and hands that always felt warm, even though they were cracked from labor. She wore her faded white uniform, still pressed and clean. He always felt proud to sit next to her, safe beside the only woman he respected more than anyone else in the world. But that day, a new driver wouldn't let them sit in the front. Even though the seats were empty, he looked at them and pointed to the rear. "Back seats only," he said flatly. Elaine looked him straight in the eye without speaking, then turned to Chancellor, took his hand gently and said, "Come on, baby." They walked all the way to the very back, sitting next to the toilet, where the smell of disinfectant clung thick and the floor was always damp. Chancellor didn't understand why his mother didn't speak up. He turned and asked, "Mama, why do we have to sit back here?" She just smiled softly, stroked his hair and said, "Because sometimes silence is how we show them we can still hold our heads high." For the rest of his life, Chancellor carried the image of his mother sitting by that toilet seat like a permanent ink stain on his soul. She didn't need anyone to know she was a nurse. She didn't need to be honored. She just needed to be treated with dignity, and the world didn't give her that. Years later, when Chancellor founded Dominion Air, he wrote a short note in his personal notebook. "No mother shall sit next to a toilet again." That line was never shared publicly. It wasn't in speeches. It wasn't on the company website. But it was the reason he designed every aircraft cabin to his own standard. No row of seats would ever be placed beside a restroom. No passenger would ever have to pass a toilet to get to their seat. And no staff member would be allowed to reassign anyone's seat based on appearances alone. Because he knew, if people were allowed to decide someone's worth by first glance, this society would be finished. Chancellor entered the quiet operations room, where security staff and coordinators were already waiting. No one said much. They greeted him with their eyes, not with fear, but with respect. He gestured to skip the formalities. In his hand, the override code still glowed faintly on his phone. One manager asked softly, "Would you like us to finalize the incident report now, sir?" Chancellor nodded. "Yes, but I want this one stored in both legal and training archives. Permanently." He sat down, the chair gently swiveling, eyes fixed on the large glass wall in front of him. Beyond that pane, he saw the aircraft still resting silently on the runway, as if it, too, was reflecting on what had just unfolded. Then, compelled by something deeper than anger or justice, Chancellor opened his laptop and navigated to the internal leadership memo section, a space where senior executives could write private reflections. He typed a simple title, Flight D-202, Final Reflections. And then he began to write. "My mother was once asked to leave a seat she had every right to occupy because she didn't look like someone who belonged there. I witnessed that when I was 10 years old. Today I watched it happen again, to myself. Not because I'm a CEO, but because I look like her. Today we corrected one mistake, but tomorrow we must correct the system that made it feel normal." When he finished typing, the clock showed it was nearly noon. From beyond the glass wall, the fading morning light cast a thin silver outline on his shoulders, an image that made a young staff member nearby instinctively pull out his phone and take a photo. Not for publicity, just because he wanted to capture the moment of a man who refused to stay silent. Chancellor stood, stretched gently, then pulled out his personal phone and dialed a familiar number. A soft, elderly voice answered on the other end. "Channy, is that you?" He smiled like a child coming home. Yes, Mama, it's me. Just wanted to say, I sat in the back today, and I remembered everything. A pause, then her voice warm as ever. You didn't just sit, baby. You stood. He chuckled lightly, but his eyes had turned red. The call ended with her gentle instruction. Keep building, Channy. Make space for the ones who never had it. Chancellor looked at the phone, then out across the airport tarmac. What filled his mind at that moment wasn't media strategy, shareholders, or damage control. It was a vision, a full-scale reform initiative, a new program named after the very place where he had been made to sit. He opened his draft planning board. The first line appeared, the 1A project, because dignity doesn't sit in the back. 8 minutes after Chancellor Holt stepped off the plane, Flight D-202 remained motionless on the runway, as if awaiting final judgment. Inside the cabin, no passenger dared to speak. Everyone had just witnessed an unprecedented reversal. A man removed from his seat because of his appearance turned out to be the one who had the authority to halt the entire flight. But what echoed most in the cabin wasn't just his shocking identity, it was his words. Sharp as blades, quiet as wind, and heavy with a shame that had never been felt so collectively. At Dominion Air's Internal Operations Center, Chancellor stood in the middle of a high-tech room, surrounded by monitoring screens, real-time flight maps, and encrypted emergency control panels. He didn't sit. He didn't need to. From where he stood, he looked directly at the central screen, showing Flight D-202, with the status, paused, override active. Senior staff waited in silence. No one asking questions, no one making assumptions. The man in front of them wasn't just the CEO, he was a living reckoning. Open a private channel to the cockpit, Chancellor said. A technician quickly connected a secure line to the captain. The screen lit up, and the pilot's tense face appeared. Captain, this is Chancellor Holt, he began calmly. I need you to hold the aircraft and await final clearance. No one moves until I give the code. The captain nodded without hesitation. Understood, sir. Chancellor then reached into his jacket and pulled out a black access card. Unlabeled, no logos, just a line of triple encrypted code. Code Warden 71. It was Dominion's highest security protocol, used only to halt an entire flight operation, to protect a passenger's dignity, or manage a human rights crisis. Until that moment, it had never been activated. He placed the card on the scanner. A prompt appeared. Activate Code Warden 71? He said without blinking. Yes. Instantly, every system connected to Flight D-202, baggage, catering, ground communications, was frozen. The flight's data was backed up and locked. A message appeared on the master display. Warden Protocol active. Executive Ethics Review initiated. Chancellor turned to the operations team. Call the Federal Ethics Panel. Send them the cabin footage. Also issue a temporary suspension for the entire crew, except flight attendant Tasha Marks. I want her involved in the review. A manager hesitated. Sir, should we notify the press? Chancellor shook his head. Not yet. This isn't about PR. This is about cleaning house. The room fell into intense focus. A young analyst handed Chancellor the detailed crew report, including unresolved behavior complaints. He scanned quickly, pausing at one section. Incidents pending review. Crew 27A. There were at least 4 filed complaints. Patterns of subtle discrimination, condescending tones toward passengers not wearing suits or not speaking fluent English. Chancellor typed one short command beneath each entry. Escalate. Direct interview required. Tasha Marks was called into a private room minutes later. Still in full uniform, her expression carried the quiet weight of the morning. Chancellor motioned to the chair across from him. Sit down, Ms. Marks. She nodded gently and sat. He studied her for a long moment before speaking. You did something most people fail to do in uniform. You saw a human being. She whispered. It just felt like the right thing, sir. Chancellor nodded, then placed a gray-labeled folder in front of her. She opened it. The title read, Dominion Air, DEI Advisory Program Pilot. Chancellor said, I want you to help design the new bias training framework, based on your experience, not from consultants. You'll collaborate with legal, ethics, and ops, but you'll lead the narrative. Her voice caught. I'm just a flight attendant. Chancellor looked at her without blinking. Not anymore. Meanwhile, across Dominion terminals and major airports, Code Warden 71 triggered alerts. First-class flights across the fleet were randomly audited for misconduct. Multiple crew members were suspended pending ethics review. No one fully understood what was happening, but everyone sensed one thing. Dominion was no longer the same airline. At 1:47 p.m., Chancellor received a new notification. A video recorded by a passenger had gone viral. Over 2.3 million views on TikTok in under 5 hours. The caption didn't mention him by name. It simply read, "Black man in suit kicked from seat 1A, then stops the plane. You won't believe what happened next." The comments were a wave of emotion, outrage, respect, and story after story of similar mistreatment. Chancellor didn't ask to take the video down. On the contrary, he instructed his team to archive every audience response, extract keywords, and begin building a real training library, written not by marketers, but by lived experiences. An hour later, an emergency internal press conference was scheduled. Chancellor didn't take the stage. He stood at the back, allowing Tasha to speak first. Her voice was unsteady, but her message was clear. No one should have to earn respect by dressing up or hiding who they are. Respect should board with you, not follow after. That line would later be printed on every sign bearing the name of the 1A project. The conference ended with one final statement from Chancellor. No slides, no script. Just a single question. From this moment forward, every action we take must answer one question. Is it building dignity or eroding it? No slogan, no applause cue, just the truth. And Dominion changed from that moment on. The Dominion Air Boeing 777 remained still like a giant statue on the runway, its nose pointing toward the dim horizon of the late afternoon sky, but its tail still facing Gate 18, the gate where Flight D202 should have taken off over an hour ago. Inside the cabin, silence was no longer surprising. It had become unsettling. Everyone knew they weren't waiting for takeoff anymore. They were waiting for something bigger, heavier, something that would never be explained away by an apology email or a first-class voucher. Chancellor Holt had left the aircraft, but his presence lingered like static in the cabin air. Passengers began whispering, murmuring. Someone had started to connect the dots. A silver-haired woman in seat 3C leaned toward her neighbor. That's the man from the Wall Street Journal cover, Dominion CEO. The person beside her widened their eyes. Wait, the guy they kicked from 1A? A businessman in row 2 shifted in his seat, brows furrowed. They didn't just kick him. They practically escorted him to the back like a criminal. And just like that, no one could sit comfortably in silence anymore. They were forced to confront something that, an hour earlier, had felt normal. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have been instructed by Dominion's executive board to return the aircraft to Gate 18. Please remain seated. This is not due to a mechanical error. We are currently undergoing an executive ethics intervention. The words rippled through the cabin like wildfire. A young passenger turned to his friend, whispering loudly, "What is an executive ethics intervention?" His friend pulled out a phone, searching online, but there were no results. That phrase had been created by Chancellor Holt just 22 minutes earlier in an emergency meeting. As the plane taxied back toward the gate, a strange energy filled the cabin. Not anger over the delay, but a mix of guilt, curiosity, and fear. Especially in first class, where those used to being served and never judged now felt as though they were the ones being observed. An older man in a brown suit, Gerald Whitmore, a retired CEO of a construction firm, sat in seat 1C, visibly uneasy. He had once donated to Dominion Air during its early days and had a passing acquaintance with Chancellor Holt back when they were both early-stage investors. But today he had not recognized Holt. Worse, he remembered nodding in approval when a flight attendant whispered to the black man, "That seat isn't for you." Now he couldn't look anyone in the eye. The plane came to a stop at Gate 18. The jet bridge extended slowly toward the aircraft, but no one was allowed to disembark yet. On the main cabin screen, a message appeared. Executive Advisory Session, commencing in 3 minutes. A few rows back, international journalist Claire Mahoney quietly opened her laptop. She had recorded much of what happened since the aircraft had stopped and was now typing a quick draft. The headline read, "The flight where power sat in the back." The aircraft door opened. But the first person to step inside wasn't a technician or a gate agent. It was a woman in a black suit wearing an Ethics and Culture Division badge. She entered, scanning the first-class cabin, and gently said, "This is not an investigation. It is an invitation to speak, to account, to learn." Behind her, three others followed, each carrying a tablet. They began approaching passengers one by one, asking a single question: "Have you witnessed or participated in any form of bias or prejudice during this flight?" No one was forced to speak, but no one dared remain silent. The first words came not from the people who had committed the act, but from those who had stood by. A young man in seat 2D spoke up. "I saw it. I saw the whole thing. I thought about saying something, but I didn't, because I thought maybe it wasn't my place." A woman in 3A, tears in her eyes, confessed, "I thought he was just some cheap upgrade passenger. He didn't look like us." And just like that, the first-class cabin, once a symbol of exclusivity, became a space of quiet confession. Farther back in economy, whispers spread as well. The story had traveled across the entire aircraft. Everyone had a part to reflect on. Everyone had something to reconsider. Meanwhile, Chancellor Holt was still monitoring the event from the command center through a private live stream, not audio or video, but real-time emotional data, voice tone graphs, and nonverbal reaction maps. He didn't need to hear every word. He needed to feel the air. And the atmosphere now was thick with a kind of reckoning he had only seen in post-crisis boardrooms, but never mid-flight in the skies of America. 1 hour later, all passengers were invited to disembark. Each received a white envelope. Inside was not money or a voucher, but a single sheet of paper with one question printed in bold. What would you have done if he wasn't the CEO? Beneath the question was a private link to a new platform called Dignity Labs, a space for people to share their experiences, reflect, and contribute to initiatives promoting equity in service-based industries. Most passengers exited in silence, but one turned back. Gerald Whitmore was the last to leave. He paused at the cabin door, looked toward the empty aisle, and whispered as if confessing to the air itself, "I saw you, Chancellor. I remember who you are now. I'm sorry I didn't the first time." That apology wasn't recorded, but it traveled, not through networks, but through glances, through the way people walked out of Gate 18 afterward, slower, more humbled, and more silent. It was an unusual Monday morning at Dominion Air's headquarters in Charlotte, North Carolina. The air felt dense even at the entrance, as if everything left unsaid on Flight D202 was now waiting to erupt here. On the 38th floor, inside the Phoenix conference room, the board of directors had been urgently summoned. There was no detailed agenda, no timeline, just one brief line in the email. Mandatory Ethics and Executive Response Session, 9 a.m. Attendance is not optional. They entered the glass-walled room overlooking the city skyline, but no one was in the mood to admire the view. Each person received a digital briefing console loaded with the full contents of the incident on Flight D202, including extracted video, behavioral analysis of the crew, media sentiment graphs, and most importantly, the full transcript of Chancellor Holt's statement. From this moment forward, every action we take must answer one question: is it building dignity or eroding it? When the glass door shut, Chancellor Holt was already standing at the far end of the room. He wasn't sitting in the chair reserved for the CEO. He wasn't holding a clicker or slides. He was just standing, alone, as if the title of CEO had never been something he needed to prove. "I'm not here to ask for your support," he began, his voice calm but chilling. "I'm here to remind us that Dominion has been asking the wrong questions, and it's time to ask new ones." The room was silent. A few board members shifted uneasily, not at his tone, but at his eyes. These weren't the eyes of an executive anymore. They were the eyes of a man who had turned himself into an instrument to expose a system. On the left side of the table, Cynthia Morgan, Vice President of Brand Development, finally spoke. "Chancellor, what you did was brave, but it may come at a cost. Our stock opened down 7.3% this morning." Chancellor didn't lower his head or refute the point. He simply said, "Real value doesn't live in short-term shares. It lives in whether a 10-year-old black child feels safe boarding our plane. He looked at all of them. When I boarded that flight wearing an unbranded gray coat, I saw a truth your internal reports never captured. That truth wasn't in the data. It was in the glances of contempt, in the polite but hollow tones, and in the tickets labeled as deserved. One board member, Thomas Greer, chief financial officer, squinted skeptically. Are you planning to steer the company towards some kind of moralized service model? We might lose high-end clientele. Chancellor smiled faintly. If their luxury depends on someone else's humiliation, then they're not clients. They're a test. You're dividing company culture. Another voice cut in, colder. It was Bruce Langford, senior legal counsel and longtime conservative advisor. By turning every interaction into an ethical trial, we risk creating fear among staff. Fear of mistakes instead of motivation to serve. Chancellor paused a few seconds before responding. I don't need them to fear. I need them to remember. Remember that every person stepping onto our aircraft carries a whole world with them, and we don't have the right to crush that world just because of the seat they're in. He took a step forward, his voice lower. And if someone cannot accept that, then they no longer belong at Dominion. Cynthia Morgan spoke again, this time her voice steadier. So, what really happened on that flight? Did they know who you were? Or did they just see a black man dressed wrong? Chancellor looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled a small voice recorder from his jacket, not to play it, but to hold it up and say, I am Chancellor Holt. I was asked to leave a first-class seat because I didn't look the part. I didn't react. I didn't explode. I simply walked to the back and watched. For 87 minutes, I watched a system operate like a biased organism, no orders given, yet every part falling into place. A large screen lit up. On it was cabin footage. Chancellor sitting in the rear, holding a small notebook. No phone, no laptop, just silently taking notes. And under the hum of engines, a conversation could be heard. Between passengers, not crew. Did you see the guy from 1A? They moved him. Probably a fake elite. Or a lucky upgrade. He didn't look like money. Each comment cut like a blade, and after each blade came a heavy silence. When the video ended, Chancellor turned back to the board. This isn't my story. This is our story. And we won't fix it with campaign posters. We'll fix it with honesty. A younger board member, Marcus Lynn, Gen Z representative, suddenly stood. I support you, not because you're the CEO, but because I've seen this happen to my mother. And I stayed silent. I don't want to stay silent anymore. The room froze for a few seconds. Then the eyes in the room slowly began to shift, not toward argument, but toward reflection. The session didn't end with a vote. It ended with a quiet consensus. Chancellor would continue to lead, but this time, not just as CEO, he would become Dominion's cultural guardian, and the very man who had once been removed from seat 1A would now set the standard for every seat on every Dominion flight. The sky above Virginia wasn't as calm as usual that day. A light gray layer of clouds drifted past the cabin windows, casting a somber mood over the passengers aboard Dominion Air, Flight D-204 from Denver to Washington, D.C., a flight that felt less like routine travel and more like a collective waiting for judgment. No one could have guessed that first class would become an airborne courtroom, a place where past and present would collide, where there were no judges but plenty of testimony, no attorneys but a room full of conscience. It was Chancellor Holt's first public appearance since the Seat 1A incident. But this time, he wasn't in a gray coat or disguised as an anonymous passenger. He wore the same black suit the press had dubbed the uniform of silent justice. And yet he didn't sit in first class, nor did he choose economy. He sat in the middle row, between two worlds, between two classes. The flight was just over 2 hours long, but the crew had received specific instructions. No public announcements, no CEO welcome, no mention of his presence. Holt wanted a neutral environment, a place where human behavior could be observed like in an ethics lab, but Dominion went further. They selected the same crew who had staffed Flight D-202, and among the passengers were 3 individuals who had witnessed the entire incident. Without saying it, this wasn't a commercial flight. This was a sky courtroom. The captain was the very same person who had authorized the seat reassignment, 2 weeks earlier. Her name was Monica Reyes, 42 years old, seasoned and once celebrated as a symbol of female leadership in aviation. But today, her eyes no longer held the shine of authority. She entered the cabin before takeoff and saw Holt sitting quietly in seat 7D. Nothing was said, but the look in his eyes was an unspoken indictment. The plane took off as usual, but the energy in the cabin was anything but. No one spoke loudly. Glances toward row 7 kept surfacing. Some recognized Holt, some didn't, but all could sense that this flight wasn't like the others. About 40 minutes after takeoff, a strange announcement came over the PA. Ladies and gentlemen, we invite the following passengers to move to first class for an internal cultural dialogue session. Mr. Peter Lawton, Ms. Alice Greer, and Mr. Jerome Bates. These were the three people who had been in first class during the original incident. They rose hesitantly. One of them whispered, "This isn't just a conversation, is it?" They were seated at the front row of first class. In front of them was a small internal live stream camera. Data only, no video sent outside the aircraft. Chancellor Holt was not physically present in the room, but he could observe through cabin cam. A corporate culture officer, Denise Alston, entered, holding a tablet. She wasn't in uniform, just a middle-aged black woman with a calm face, compassionate eyes, but no softness in her purpose. "Thank you for joining us," she said. "Today, no one is being accused. No one is being judged. But each of us must answer one question. When you saw injustice, what did you do?" Peter, a 58-year-old investor, lowered his head. "I saw him being removed. I knew something felt wrong, but I thought maybe he had done something to deserve it. I told myself it wasn't my place." Alice Greer, an immigration attorney, spoke next. "I felt uneasy, but I stayed quiet. I worried that if I spoke up, I'd be seen as disruptive." Jerome, a former military officer, shrugged. "I honestly thought he was a low-level employee trying to sneak into first class. That's the bias I lived with for years." Denise offered no judgment. She only asked, if he hadn't been the CEO, how would the story have ended? No one had an answer. Meanwhile, the flight crew had been invited to a separate dialogue session in the rear cabin. They didn't know what to say. But before anyone could ask a question, one flight attendant broke down in tears. "I followed protocol. I didn't know who he was, but I know how I spoke to him was wrong, and I can't take that back." First class was silent. A passenger in row 2 whispered, "Are we being recorded?" A culture staff member gently shook her head. "No, but your self-respect is listening." A young passenger, a student, took out his phone and tweeted, "I'm on the strangest flight of my life. The CEO is sitting in the middle row. First class has turned into a courtroom. This is a real sky courtroom." The flight landed at 3:12 p.m. in Washington. No one was fired. No one was punished. But as each passenger deplaned, they were handed a small envelope. Inside was a single slip of paper that read, "Today, you were seen. Tomorrow, will you see others?" The story didn't spread because of drama. It spread because of truth, a truth that didn't need shouting or scandal. It spread because people saw themselves in it. And so, from the quiet of a commercial aircraft, Dominion created a new kind of courtroom, not needing judges, lawyers, or courtrooms. Just conscience. That Thursday, Dominion Air released a brief statement. "We're not fixing an error. We're redesigning the very concept of service justice." No logo, no images, just black text on white background, like a new oath. But within minutes of that announcement, the entire U.S. aviation industry trembled. At a surprise press conference held in Houston, where over 40 major news outlets had gathered, Chancellor Holt stepped onto a bare stage. No banners, no slogans, no host. He stood there alone, as if to prove that real justice needs no spotlight. He began with a question. What happens when justice arrives too late? People learn to live without it, and that's the most dangerous thing of all. He paused for a few seconds. The room was so quiet you could hear the click of every camera capturing his every move. Then he said, "As of today, Dominion will no longer wait for complaints to be filed, for hashtags to trend, or for videos to go viral. We will act on the spot. That is why we are launching a system called Instant Justice." What is the Instant Justice system? Chancellor held up a small silver card, thin as a credit card, embedded with a chip. Every lead flight attendant, ground supervisor, and airport manager at Dominion will carry this card. It is not a badge of power, it is a badge of responsibility. He placed the card on the podium. With one scan, they can activate 3 immediate actions. 1. Pause a flight or service if clear discrimination is observed. 2. Send an internal alert to the Ethics Command Unit, our cultural division stationed at major hubs. 3. Trigger a behavioral log sent directly to executive leadership. The room stirred. No airline had ever granted its frontline staff the authority to suspend operations, especially not for non-technical reasons. An NBC reporter quickly asked, "Don't you think this could disrupt flight schedules?" Holt answered without blinking, "Justice doesn't delay flights. Disregard for people does." Within 24 hours of the press conference, hotspots across the country began deploying the Instant Justice Protocol. At O'Hare Airport in Chicago, a black passenger was pulled aside for random screening twice in a row without explanation. The area supervisor, trained under the new program, immediately scanned the card. Security footage was reviewed, and within 6 minutes, the passenger received a formal apology and was escorted to the first-class lounge, even though he held an economy ticket. The staff member involved wasn't fired on the spot, but was given a 3-day leave to attend a bias recovery course. At Atlanta Airport, a check-in agent refused assistance to an elderly Chinese woman because she couldn't speak English clearly. A young bystander witnessing the exchange hit the emergency alert panel. Less than 10 minutes later, the woman was guided to her gate by a bilingual staff member, and the original agent was required to submit a personal incident statement. But the system wasn't just built to address harm. Instant justice was also designed to reward immediate decency. On a flight from Dallas to Phoenix, a flight attendant noticed a deaf passenger and promptly moved him to an aisle seat near the emergency exit for better communication and safety. The lead attendant scanned the card to register a positive action. 8 hours later, the crew member received a thank you email from the CEO's office and an invitation to mentor-level cultural training. Chancellor Holt didn't speak to the media after the press conference. He disappeared for 3 days. But frontline workers began speaking out. Self-filmed clips at terminals, blog posts describing the first time I saw justice arrive on time, hashtags like number real-time respect and number justice in flight started to appear. Dominion launched no media campaign, but the public did it for them. People talked about instant justice like they talked about a new seatbelt, mandatory, but meant to protect both sides. And amid the market's chaotic response, one truth became clear. Dominion was no longer just an airline. It had become the pioneer of justice without delay. 30 days after the Sky Courtroom tweet went viral across America, Dominion Air didn't just change its policies. They launched something symbolic, the 1A Project. The name didn't come from a business term or a flashy PR campaign. It came from the very seat Chancellor Holt was once denied. Seat 1A, typically reserved for the most important person on the plane, was now transformed into a symbol of humility, awareness, and action in the name of justice. The first announcement from the 1A Project shook the entire aviation industry. Starting next month, Seat 1A on all Dominion flights would no longer be available for purchase. Instead, each day, one ordinary person, someone who had shown courage, kindness, or risen above hardship, would be invited to sit in 1A as a gesture of recognition. There would be no speeches, no interviews, just a small printed message on a nameplate. Today, Seat 1A belongs to someone who chose dignity. The 1A Project wasn't another reward program. No points, no frequent flyer metrics, no performance rankings. Instead, frontline workers, flight attendants, janitors, shuttle drivers, check-in agents, were given the exclusive right to nominate candidates. Each week, every airport would submit 3 names with short descriptions. An internal ethics advisory board, composed entirely of non-management representatives, would select the honoree. No CEO, no CMO, no executive could override it. There were no camera crews, no sponsors, no media allowed on board. The honoree would only discover their recognition upon boarding, when they saw Seat 1A left empty, bearing the small message, "Today, Seat 1A belongs to someone who chose dignity," and every other passenger would simply read it, reflect quietly, and draw their own conclusions. The first person selected for seat 1A was someone no one expected. Rufus Clark, 63, a janitor at Detroit Airport. The previous week, he had intervened when he saw a mother of Ethiopian descent being pulled away from the restroom by security simply because she couldn't understand English. Rufus not only stepped in to translate, but also documented the incident and submitted it to the airport's cultural office. Surveillance footage later revealed that he had helped de-escalate the entire situation, calmly shielding the mother's 4-year-old from panic. No grand gestures, no tweet, just an act of quiet integrity. That morning, when Rufus arrived at the airport to begin his shift, he was called to the executive office. He assumed he was being reprimanded for something, but instead he was handed a first-class ticket to San Diego, where his wife was undergoing cancer treatment. The ticket had no seat number. It wasn't until he boarded that he saw the placard before 1A. Today, seat 1A belongs to someone who chose dignity. As the plane prepared for takeoff, a young passenger turned to her mother and whispered, "Mom, what do I have to do to sit in that seat someday?" The mother didn't answer right away. She looked over at Rufus folding his coat, his eyes simple yet full of quiet honor. Then she replied, "Just know what's right and have the courage to do it, even if no one's watching." At the end of the boarding ramp, Chancellor Holt stood in the shadows. He didn't board. He didn't speak. He didn't pose for photos. He just stood there, eyes on seat 1A, then turned and walked away. That day, Dominion Air didn't need another ad campaign. All they needed was one placard, one decent human being, and one seat that had once been denied. And so, from a moment of silent humiliation, Dominion transformed seat 1A into a place that honored dignity, for everyone brave enough to choose what's right. The storm began in silence. No commercial, no airline announcement, no formal statement from the CEO. But when a short video, barely 30 seconds, captured an elderly janitor quietly sitting down in seat 1A, his trembling hands resting his coat on his knees, his eyes locking onto the nameplate that read, "Today, seat 1A belongs to someone who chose dignity," America lost its composure. The person who filmed it wasn't a journalist, not an influencer, just a regular passenger using their phone to capture that fleeting moment and posting it on X, formerly Twitter, with a simple caption, "I cried. And I'm not the crying type." Within just 12 hours, the post had over 1 million views. Within 36, it was on morning talk shows, news broadcasts, and TikTok reaction videos. The hashtag #seat1A exploded. Hundreds of people shared photos of their own seats, work chairs, bus seats, classroom desks, marked with handwritten signs, "Reserved for someone who chose dignity." Instagram users began renaming their profiles to "One a Citizen." Musicians remixed the janitor's soft voice, "Thank you, but I'm not used to sitting here," into emotional tracks. And still, Dominion Air said nothing. Not a single official post, not a comment, no press release. And precisely because of that silence, the storm only spread wider. The public began to believe that this wasn't a marketing campaign. It was something real, something right, something they had all assumed was extinct in commercial air travel: kindness without a camera. The ripple effect didn't stop online. Within a week, over 27 schools across the U.S. reported adopting Seat 1A as a classroom and auditorium ritual, where students, teachers, or custodial staff who showed quiet, humane acts would be invited to sit in the seat as a weekly gesture of honor. A high school in Boston placed a wooden chair in the library with a plaque, "Not for the best student, but for the kindest this week." A rehabilitation center in Phoenix reported they used the Seat 1A concept to recognize inmates who helped fellow prisoners, not to shorten sentences, but to remind them their worth hadn't expired. In Seattle, a small coffee chain marked their 1A seat each morning with a free espresso, only if the previous customer had nominated someone deserving. Tiny handwritten nominations taped to the exposed brick wall read, "He pushed a wheelchair outside in the rain because the person wanted to hear the birds," or "She apologized on behalf of a server who forgot an order." No photos, no tags, just trembling penmanship and trust passed forward. Mainstream media split down the middle. CNN invited psychologists to explain why a seat could trigger such a collective emotional response. Fox News raised suspicion. Is this a PR attempt to whitewash Dominion's internal management issues? One independent podcast went further. Is Seat 1A distracting from structural problems like racism, wage inequality, and labor rights in the service industry? Meanwhile, editorials began to call it a new model of inspiration, not built on pity, but on ethical action. Holt remained silent. For 3 weeks, he was nowhere to be seen. Reporters searched for him at Dominion HQ, his home, his family's old retreat, even the universities where he once taught. No one found him. Speculation swirled. Did he lose control? Is this the brainchild of a rogue marketing team? Or worse, is he just waiting for the market to settle before an IPO? In the fourth week, a single message appeared on Dominion's internal site. No headline, just one line. Dignity doesn't need a defense. Signed, CH. Then on day 30, a letter from UNESCO was made public. It read, Seat 1A represents what the world needs most. The ability to honor what is right before what is wrong becomes culture. Dominion was invited to Geneva to present Seat 1A as a model at the International Summit on 21st Century Humanitarian Service. In Geneva, Chancellor Holt appeared in public for the first time since being escorted from Seat 1A. He wore no suit, gave no speech, had no slideshow. He simply stood before a room of over 300 representatives from 48 nations and said quietly, "We didn't invent dignity. We just stopped blocking it." A full minute later, the entire room stood in applause. Not because he was a CEO, but because he hadn't claimed credit for doing the right thing. He had let it speak for itself. The event was broadcast globally. Seat 1A, once a symbol of privilege, had become a banner for the normalization of decency. And that night, an anonymous article spread rapidly on Medium. The man who once couldn't sit now lets the world stand up. No one knows who wrote it, but Holt saved the piece, printed it out, and folded it in thirds. The next day, he left it on the first one, a seat of the flight returning from Geneva to New York, then stepped off the plane without looking back. Holt didn't look back, but America couldn't stop looking after him. The flight from Geneva to New York the next morning sold out in less than 11 minutes after bookings reopened. But no one boarded to sit in Seat 1A. They came to witness who would. And that seat, for the first time in commercial aviation history, remained empty for the entire transatlantic journey, except for one neatly folded slip of paper resting on the leather cushion. A printed copy of the anonymous article, "The man who once couldn't sit now lets the world stand up." No one dared touch it. No one asked to switch seats. No one even took a selfie. An older passenger in Seat 2A merely whispered, "It feels sacred now." Dominion Air offered no explanation. Yet every flight from that day forward followed the same quiet tradition. One Seat 1A left open, with a small plaque bearing the name of someone nominated by passengers, crew, or strangers who had witnessed a quiet act of grace. The program was never promoted, never had a sign-up form. Seats were selected based on handwritten letters, sometimes scribbled in pencil from a rural hospital in Arkansas or a laundromat in the Bronx. Then one day, without announcement, Seat 1A was occupied again, by Holt himself. Not on a shareholder flight, not on an international route, but on a domestic leg, from New Orleans to Charlotte, where an Asian American flight attendant had been shouted at, threatened, and denied service by a passenger for not sounding American enough. The news spread internally, and Holt, without a word, appeared, standing quietly in the boarding queue, wearing glasses, holding a book, and choosing to sit once more in that seat. For the first time after all the upheaval, the seat was reclaimed by the very man who created it, not to honor himself, but to defend the value it had come to represent. And in that moment, everything began again. That flight, barely over an hour, became the final symbol capping a series of extraordinary events few ever believed could be ignited by one silent action. No one recognized Holt at first until a young attendant whispered from the rear, "That's him." Holt didn't respond. He simply nodded and turned toward the window. The passenger who had previously dismissed him froze mid-step, not daring to place their hand on the overhead bin. A young woman seated beside Holt leaned in and asked quietly, "Are you really Mr. Holt?" He didn't answer, just smiled faintly. Holt remained still, doing nothing, saying nothing. Yet the entire cabin seemed suspended in a strange stillness, grateful, tense, reverent. When the lead attendant announced cabin is secure, every crew member glanced towards seat 1A, not to confirm the safety belt, but as if waiting for a signal from a living symbol. As the plane took off, silence filled the cabin. No laptops opened, no music played. Instead, an elderly woman in 3C pulled out a journal and began to write. A brown-skinned boy behind her opened his sketch pad and quietly tried to draw the face of the man in seat 1A. And when the attendant served drinks, no one asked for anything extra. There were no complaints. No one pressed the call button. Upon landing, Holt stood, adjusted his jacket. Before stepping out, he paused and looked directly at the young Asian-American flight attendant who had endured the earlier incident. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't hand her a business card. He simply said 4 words. "Keep the seat open." She nodded, eyes brimming, and that was the last time Holt was seen sitting in 1A. 1 week later, Dominion officially announced the Seat Reclaim Project, an independent nonprofit organization, commercially unaffiliated, without Dominion's branding, and with no glossy headquarters. Its mission, to honor dignity through unseen acts. Within its first 3 months, over 12,000 nominations poured in from 49 states. A single father in Missouri, size 14 shoes, stood outside his son's classroom for 3 hours a day just to help him read the blackboard. A resident doctor in Newark used her own money to buy blankets for unhoused patients. A stadium janitor in Los Angeles returned a lost wallet with a note. "I don't need this money as much as you need your honor back." But the most striking moment came from a raw, unedited video, exactly 7 minutes and 13 seconds long, uploaded to YouTube by a tech worker without a title or description. The video showed Holt stepping off the New Orleans-Charlotte flight, walking toward the airport shuttle, then suddenly turning to face the camera, smiling and saying, "The seat was never mine. I just kept it warm for someone better." That sentence alone was printed on thousands of posters, T-shirts, and school bulletin boards across the country. When asked whether he would return to his executive role at Dominion, Holt only replied, "I already did," in silence. And then, once again, he disappeared. People say that sometimes the ones who transform an entire culture aren't those who speak the loudest, but those who know when to step aside and let the right thing be heard. And so, seat 1A, once a symbol of privilege, once the epicenter of silent injustice, became a space for restoration, for apologies without words, for those once pushed aside. It was finally returned to its rightful place. And perhaps the strangest thing of all is this. No one remembers where that flight took off from, or where it was headed. They only remember seat 1A, the place that was once a symbol of exclusion, and somehow became the birthplace of dignity restored. A seat no longer reserved for privilege, but reclaimed for those who quietly uphold the soul of this world, unseen and uncelebrated. Have you ever met someone like that? Someone quietly kind, who doesn't need a spotlight or applause? If you have, share their story in the comments below. So the world knows that there are still countless seat 1As waiting to be filled by acts of grace. If you believe justice doesn't have to scream and kindness deserves to be seen, tap that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss stories like this. One small click from you could help thousands of others find a little light in the noise. Because sometimes the thing that moves us most isn't a grand gesture, but the quiet moment when someone like Chancellor Holt chooses silence so that what's right can finally speak.